participate, I'll just go down here and talk to them. Ah, you didn't hear me? You know, I have a daughter your age. She tells me the same thing. Dad, I didn't hear you. Oh, yeah, it's a bad neighborhood. I wouldn't move in over there. Never move in next to the generator. Right? All right. Everybody having a good day? Yeah. You know, by the sound of your voices, I'm not really sure. You're going to have to convince me. You're going to have to convince me you're having a good day. There we go. All right. So, you ready for the vehicle parade? Yeah. Okay. Let me go down here and check. You know, if I could get everybody in one place, I wouldn't have to walk so much. How about you guys down here on the right? Are you ready for the vehicle parade? Ready for the parade? Yeah? He sort of kind of look at me like he's not sure. Oh, you're ready, brother. You are ready for this. All right, if you haven't been here before, this is like the highlight of our day. Bring all the vehicles out, have a number of great narrators. They're going to educate you on all of the vehicles we have in the collection, all of which are going to ride right by you. Anybody been here before? Really? We got a bunch of freshmen here today? Yeah, for freshmen, give yourself a hand. Yeah, man. Oh boy, you kids in for a treat. This is better than NASCAR. You know why? There's more dirt. You gotta have dirt to have fun, right? Anybody got kids? Anybody got clean kids? You're a clean kid? Dirty kids are much more fun. That's right. If it ain't dirty, it ain't fun, right? There you go. All right, we're going to do a little something to keep you motivated. I'm still waiting for a couple of the speakers to show up. So we're going to do something I do all up and down the East Coast. Don't ask me why. I think my wife just needs a weekend away from me. So I drive up and down the East Coast. I do some announcing. I get to meet some great people such as yourselves. Give yourselves a hand. Give yourselves a hand. All right. You can do it. All right. Can we encourage them down here to participate? Come on, join us, would you? Participate with us. Give yourselves a hand. And I get the one hand. It's Pennsylvania, you can use both hands. There we go. All right, I have to make a quick announcement. I'll be right back, so don't think I'm being rude by turning my back to you. Do you mind if I do my job real quick? Okay, all right. If you are a visitor, and I think we have the last two coming across the line now, thunder across the plains with a hearty hi-oh silver. Here they come. Let's encourage them. Let's encourage them to get across the finish line. Come on, give them some encouragement. There they go. Yes! Across the finish line. All right. I think all of our announcers here now? All right. You ready? Ready on the left?
Yeah!
Ready on the right?
Yeah!
All right. All yours, Mike.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Fritzak, and you are here at the second annual Wheels of Liberation Open House. So, thank you. Wheels of Liberation is a collection of World War II vehicles, artillery pieces, and other memorabilia dedicated to the Allied struggles and eventual victory during World War II in liberating Europe. So, just a little recap. World War II was probably the greatest event and most influential event of the 20th century. It involved every nation in Europe and many nations throughout the world. And its repercussions and eventual results still affect politics and life today. That's why understanding what happened then might give you a better understanding of what's going on today. World War II started on September 1st, 1939, with German invasion of my home country, Poland. 17 days later into that invasion, Soviet Russia invaded Poland as well. And that goes quite contrary to a generally accepted narrative that the Soviets, the Russians, were actually allies of Americans, British. Initially, they were actual enemies and allies of Nazi Germany. Only the German invasion of Soviet Russia in 1941 changed that. One of our first segments will include vehicles used by the Polish Army in 1939. Now the campaign of 1939 was the first campaign lost by the Allies. France and England were allies of Poland, and at that time they were supposed to attack Germany and possibly end World War II in 1939. That did not happen. Now, Germany achieved a relatively quick victory in Poland. Within 30 days, entire Poland was occupied. Germany developed a revolutionary method of conducting warfare. That revolutionary method of conducting warfare is called commonly the Blitzkrieg. It involved creating massive superiority of materiel, men and materiel, that would be spearheaded by their tanks, supported by the infantry, mounted infantry, half trucks, artillery, and dive bombers. Achieve breakthrough, pen these motorized troops behind enemy lines to create confusion and panic. It worked very well in Poland, worked very well in France. Nevertheless, Polish campaign was not an easy campaign for Germany. It was heavily contested by Polish forces. Poland was occupied, but Poland never surrendered. And this will be part of our narrative. Now, the very first vehicle approaching us here is the Polish tankette. So tankettes are one of those forgotten weapons of World War II. They were small, tracked reconnaissance vehicles that were built with automotive components, Ford Model A engine, a truck axle, 3-speed transmission. They were designed as cheap reconnaissance vehicles and training vehicles in hopes that in the future bigger tanks can replace these. Nevertheless, Poland was not able to produce a large number of tanks, and this was their most numerous armored vehicle. 600 of these were used. The most common version, like you see here, was equipped with a World War I French Hotchkiss Model 1914 machine gun. But small number of these tankettes were also equipped with a 20mm anti-tank rifle, and those were quite effective against early German tanks at the time, so that Panzer I, II, and even the early versions of Panzer III and IV. Now, following our tankette is the Polski Fiat, the Polish Fiat, a civilian cabriolet, four-door cabriolet, which were built as a license in Poland and were the most common vehicles in Poland. Quite often, Polish officers would use them as their staff cars, and we see that car packed to escape to fight again. Tankettes were developed in England by a company called Carden Lloyd. Licenses were sold to many countries throughout the world. For example, British used these in England. Italians built over 2,500 of similar tankettes called CG, Caro Veloce 33, 35, and 38. Russians built a similar vehicle called T-27. Nevertheless, due to their diminutive size, light armament, they became obsolete very quickly, and they were forgotten later on. That's why we would like to show you how warfare in 1939 and 1940 looked like. It was full of much smaller vehicles than what you might know of being used later in the war. Big Shermans, Tigers or Panthers. Panzer I, the principal vehicle used by the German army in Poland in 1939, wasn't necessarily that much bigger than this tiny tankette. It had a crew of 2 and a small rotating turret with 2 machine guns. So the Polish campaign was fought very hard by Polish troops. Polish troops were mostly on foot. The cavalry used still horses. So Polish retreat under the overwhelming odds was outrun by forward mechanized units of German army, which led to Polish withdrawal and eventual ending of campaign on 4th of October. Nevertheless, the Polish spirit lived on. A lot of Polish personnel was able to filter out of Poland through Romania and Hungary and fight on in the very next campaign in 1940 in France. Now, campaign in France was different, at least initially on paper. France had a larger army than Nazi Germany, equipped in many cases with superior equipment. Many of their tanks were much better armed and armored than the best German tanks. Nevertheless, French still did not develop a proper doctrine to use them in large units. They were still in the process of forming their units. So their deployment also relied heavily on the reliance of their Maginot Line, heavily defended line of forts. Germans bypassed that heavily fortified line of Maginot Line, attacked Holland, Belgium, bypassing it. Now, this is our tribute to that campaign. We have another tankette, Renault UE, a French tankette. Now this is no longer a combat tankette. This is a gun tractor used also to resupply troops. It's towing a 25mm gun. Now look at the size of that gun. This puny little anti-tank gun, the Hotchkiss model 1934, was sufficient to defeat early German tanks in 1940. We'll talk about that because those guns will get much bigger as the German tanks get bigger. Now following that is the 1937 Chevrolet, towing probably the most significant gun ever built. This is the French 75, model 1897. So a gun that was designed in 1897 was the principal weapon of the French army during the First World War, but it's still soldiered on during World War II, and we will go to that gun again. Pay attention to that French 75, because it was still one of the most important guns half a century later during World War II. So the distinction that that gun holds is that it's the first gun that it had a fully functional hydro-pneumatic recoil system. What it means that this gun, when fired, stayed stationary. Only the barrel cycles back and forth, which means that any successive shot fired that gun landed exactly in the same spot. The gun could be fired 20 times a minute, almost like a rifle, bolt-action rifle. again, the most numerous vehicle, gun in the French army. Some of them were captured by Germans and still in a slightly redesigned configuration used on the Russian front way up until 1944. The little staff car that is sitting stationary out in the field is a Citroën traction, used again by staff of the French army, and that car has a distinction of being the first unibody, modern design car with front wheel drive. Again, we have a Renault Tanquette approach us again. Now, the French campaign went badly for the Allies. German incursion into Belgium and Holland ended up in encirclement of the forces, Allied forces, French and British Expeditionary Force there, that resulted with their evacuation out of Dunkirk. Over 300,000 Allied troops, mostly British, were evacuated by a flotilla of small private craft. That was one of the bright spots in that campaign. Nevertheless, the personnel that evacuated had to leave their heavy guns behind, their tanks behind, but they lived to fight again. We are experiencing some of the typical problems encountered by armies of those days. So this is for the realism. We planned it to get stuck in mud. So the evacuation out of Dunkirk happened at the end of May of 1940. The French campaign still continued for almost 4 weeks. Nevertheless, these were defensive rearguard actions which resulted in truce between Germany and France. France occupied 60% of French territory. The remainder became a puppet state of Vichy, a collaborationist government aligned with Vichy, with Germany. Vichy government also controlled French colonial territories, such as in Northern Africa, Morocco, Algeria and Syria, and we will go to that later. This will be part of our campaign later on. Now, 1940, most of Europe is occupied by Nazi Germany. Nazi German occupation is brutal. Freedoms are taken away. A lot of citizenry of occupied countries is arrested, executed, put in concentration camps. The hope is nearly lost for the Allied cause. Nevertheless, there is one island that still resists German onslaught, and that's Great Britain. Great Britain, after evacuating its British expeditionary force out of Dunkirk, sitting down, waiting for the German invasion. Nevertheless, Germans now need to cross a significant body of water called the English Channel. British still rules the seas. British Royal Navy is the mightiest navy in the world. To expel British Navy from English Channel, German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, need to achieve the air superiority over the English Channel and destroy the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force. And this is the next battle for the Allied cause. British pilots engage German onslaught of bombers and fighters. They fight very bravely, but it's an attritional struggle. Both sides lose a lot of pilots, a lot of planes. Planes are easier to replace than trained pilots. At the same time as the Battle of Great Britain commences, Polish troops that fought also in France are able to evacuate, including 75% of their air force. Their pilots are some of the best trained in the world. Polish pilots fought bravely in 1939 defense of their home country in 1940, but in most cases they flew obsolete planes. This time they are given modern planes, Hawker Hurricanes. 2 squadrons are formed, and the Polish pilots finally are able to meet the Luftwaffe on their own terms. Polish pilots performed very well. 2 Polish squadrons and individual Polish pilots embedded within RAF shoot 7.5% of all German planes in that conflict. They shoot down over 200 German planes. Polish 303 Kościuszko Squadron is the highest scoring squadron of any other squadrons within RAF. And this is one of the proudest moments in the Polish military history. Now, this was a truly deciding moment for the Allied cause. Had Germans been able to invade England, World War II probably would have ended then. Normandy landings would never be able to happen. That's why this was the first significant victory, probably the most significant victory for the Allies, the defeat of Luftwaffe over the skies of Britain. We're gonna discuss now the involvement of the German army, particularly the Großdeutschland division. Here's my friend.
Guten Tag, ich bin Hauptfeldwebel Rudolf Langer mit 7. Company, Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland. Good day to you all. I am Rudolf Langer, a Hauptfeldwebel in 7th Company Großdeutschland. The vehicles that you will soon shortly be seeing entering the field would be various light German vehicles that you would have seen on every single front throughout all of World War II. They took place in the invasion of Poland, Unternehmen Fall-Gelb in France, the lower Greek states, Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and into the invasion of Rusland, or Russia, which is where the particular division you see spent a majority of their time fighting on the Eastern Front. With it being the 85th anniversary of Unternehmen Fall-Gelb, the invasion of France, we were going to talk about that a little bit. The first vehicle that is coming out is a Kübelwagen, which in German means bucket seat. This was a very light and easily manufactured vehicle that in a lot of films you'll see staff officers using, but it was actually meant to be a troop transport. It has an extremely smooth bottom of the vehicle, so it actually had an opportunity to slide right over many obstacles. As it passes by, you will see there's a small hole in between the 2 wheels in the middle of the vehicle. A pole could be stuck through that and the vehicle could simply be lifted up. This is because the Kübelwagen was extremely light. 53,000 of these vehicles were built from 1940 until 1945. They were used to pull artillery, field kitchens, transport troops, ambulances, etc. Followed behind the Kübelwagen is the Motorkraftrad, or the motorcycles. Motorcycles were extremely popular as civilian use in Germany, and some say that the addition of the sidecar was so that the German men could pick up their German Fräuleins and go on dates. Whether that is true or not, I am not sure. However, they were extremely light and quick, and were known as the eyes and ears of the German Wehrmacht, or the German army. They were the first to meet the enemy. Due to their agility and speed, they were able to quickly reconnoiter different areas and report back. Many of these motorcyclists were heavily armed with K98 Mauser rifles, MT40 submachine guns, and many of the sidecars actually had mounted machining gewehr, or MG34s, right on the sidecar. This made them a very formidable opponent to the Allied forces until the main body of the German military could catch up with them. The particular motocross rod that you see out here are a BMW R12 and a BMW R75. Over 36,000 of these machines were made from 1935 until the end of the war. Eventually they were slowly, even though they were seen throughout the war, they were slowly phased out and sort of replaced by the Kugelwagen, again because it was much easier to produce. The vehicle that you see in the rear is a Horse, which is in German a Schwergeländegänge, PKW, which is a heavy overland troop transport vehicle. As you can see, troops can sit in the back. There is a mounted MG42 on that for anti-aircraft defenses, but because they were so physically strong, they could pull very heavy loads, whether it be heavier artillery pieces, field kitchens, you name it. 60,000 various light armored vehicles were made for the German Wehrmacht throughout the war, as they saw the extreme need for it, as they had their blitzkrieg tactics and covered a majority of Europe. 8,135 of the specific Horse vehicles that you see, and again that's the last vehicle in the back, were made, and almost 1,900 were made in the Ford plant that was in Cologne, Germany at that time. The Großdeutschland units that you see here in the field, they were not a full division at the time of the invasion of France, however they were an infantry regiment that had been mobilized. Originally, they were the troops that protected the government buildings and war memorials in Berlin. They had the distinct honor of having been known as some of the first troops in France, as over 100 soldiers from this regiment were put onto four-man planes and flown in behind enemy lines. And then the armored vehicles thrust forward in Unternehmen Vollgeld. This unit was one of the units that met some of the first French tank forces in the severe fighting. However, instead of using masses of armor as the Germans utilized, the French would send them out in piecemeal. And this was a disaster for them, as they were eventually picked apart by some of the heavier artillery pieces and the Panzer IIIs that the German army had fielded.
Thank you very much. So, we saw the main enemy here, the main antagonist of our story, the Germany, one of the mightiest armies in the world. But the mightiest army in the world achieved some remarkable successes. In 1939 in Poland, in 1940 in France, in the Balkans, in Greece and Yugoslavia, but in 1941, on June 22nd, the German army finally met its match and attacked the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had absolutely the largest army in the world. Nevertheless, the Soviet army of 1941 was a very ineptly run, a stumbling colossus. So, come June 22nd, a surprise attack of Soviet Russia, of absolutely the largest army in the world, by the largest army in the world, created the largest campaign ever fought in human history. At its peak, nearly 10 million combatants participated in action on the Eastern Front. Germany, through its blitzkrieg tactics, achieved some brilliant advances into Russia, giant encirclements in what's now Ukraine and Belarus yielded over 3 million prisoners in the summer and fall of 1941. Germans came within 30 miles of Moscow. Nevertheless, the Russian great allies came to Russian help. That ally is the Russian winter. German forces were slated for a short summer campaign. They were not equipped and supplied for the severity of the Russian winter. At the gates of Moscow, Germans suffered their second defeat of the war. They were repelled from the gates of Moscow with severe losses to material and men. So in 1942, their focus became sustainability of the war. To sustain the war, Germany desperately needed the oil to power their tanks, planes, ships. And that oil was in the Caucasus region of southern Russia. This is where the main effort of the German advance in 1942 was. Initially, again, just like in 1941, it was successful. Germany occupied giant swaths of Russian territory. Nevertheless, Russian army, the inept, stumbling colossus, is learning slowly how to fight Germans. Russians no longer allow for giant encirclements of their troops. They fight more of a rearguard retreat warfare, trading terrain for time so they can rebuild their army that lost over 3 million soldiers the previous year. Germany advances deep into the Russia. They reach some of the fields of Caucasus, but they also have to fight for a strategic River Volga hub at Stalingrad. You might have heard that name. This becomes one of the largest battles. Now Russians are fiercely defending Stalingrad. You might have seen the movie Enemy at the Gate. There is some truth to that, quite a bit of truth there. It's a desperate action which yields another severe defeat in the Russian winter of 1942 and 43. From that point on, Germany loses its tactical and strategic edge. One more engagement in the summer of 1943, the Kursk tank battle, the largest tank battle where somewhere around 3,000 tanks fight each other, is again a tactical defeat to Germany, and from that point on, Germany is on a constant retreat. That retreat initially slowed down, then it speeds up. By 1944, Soviet Union reclaims its most of its lost territory, and it enters terrain of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. 1944 is a very successful year for Soviet Russia. And it ends not far from Berlin on the Oder River. The spearhead of the Russian advance is the most iconic tank of World War II, the T-34, the first truly modern tank. This tank has sloped armor, which greatly increases the protection against incoming rounds. It has very wide track that prevents those vehicles from sinking in deep mud or deep snow. And it has a dual-purpose gun, a gun that can fire armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition, and this is the most produced tank of World War II. Over 50,000 examples are made. This is the final version, equipped with the 85mm. Another revolutionary feature of that vehicle is that it gets a diesel engine. All other nations fight with vehicles that get gasoline engines. Now, what's following our T-34 are two American-made vehicles. Wait a minute, this is a Russia. What are American-made WC-52 weapons carrier and the US-6 Studebaker doing on the Eastern Front? Now, this is a very important part of narrative. Russia did not fight alone. Russia was an ally of the United States and Great Britain. And United States had this program called Lend-Lease, where it would provide armaments, tanks, planes, ships, trucks, guns to every other nation that would fight against the common enemy, such as Nazi Germany. That's why you see these American-made vehicles. And this was a very important part of the Russian Central medical supply. Our WC-52 is towing the Soviet 120mm mortar, and the Studebaker is towing the principal medium field artillery M30, model 1938, 122mm divisional howitzer. Artillery was one of the main breakthrough tools for the Soviet army. Every major attack initiated by the Soviet army was preceded by a massive barrage of artillery of every caliber, including multiple rocket launchers called Katyushas. Campaign 1944 happened on previously occupied terrain, Poland, that was occupied in 1939. Even though Russians were a nominal enemy of Poland, when Germany attacked Russia, Russians, being enemy of the enemy, became somewhat of an inconvenient ally for the Poles. The imprisoned Poles, Russia imprisoned over 2 million Polish citizens into their gulags and war camps, executed over 35,000 of Polish citizens, Polish officers, doctors, judges, and other people that were deemed dangerous to the Soviet regime. Nevertheless, Poles wanted to go back to Poland, to their free Poland. And sometimes the only way was to side with your former enemy, and that's what happened. Poland fielded the second largest army on the Eastern Front. At the time of the Berlin offensive in 1945, out of the 2 million combatants fighting for Berlin, 10% of them, 200,000 of them, were Polish. We will go back to that narrative in a few minutes. What we will see now is some of the American vehicles that were used by American infantry divisions. Now, Americans built 50,000 Shermans, the second most numerous tank. Nevertheless, they also built vehicles that very much looked like tanks, but they were not tanks. They built the tank destroyers. Remember the tiny little 25mm anti-tank gun told by that tiny tankette earlier on that could destroy German tanks. In 1943 and 1944, those tiny puny guns were called door knockers. They were totally useless. Anti-tank guns had to get much bigger, to a point that they could no longer be moved by small vehicles. The best way to bring them into combat is to mount them on tracked vehicles that look very much like a tank. So what's approaching us is one of Hellcat, M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. Look at the size of that gun. That big gun, the 76mm gun, now was barely enough to destroy the new generation of German medium and heavy tanks such as the Panther and Tiger. Nevertheless, this M18 Hellcat holds two distinctions. One of them, that it is still the fastest armored vehicle ever built, 72 miles per hour. Luckily, it was governed down to 50 miles per hour. Why? Because if you issue these M18 Hellcats to 17 and 18-year-olds, what can go wrong? The second distinction for this Hellcat is that this is the only Allied vehicle that held the positive kill ratio. For every Hellcat destroyed by enemy forces, Hellcat destroyed 2.4 German tanks. What's following the Hellcat is the American head truck, probably the most ubiquitous vehicle on the Western Front, also supplied to the Russians. It's in its primary role personnel carrier. The smallest infantry unit, the squad of 12 people, can be carried into the battle within reasonable safety of its armor. Other specialized versions, such as a pack howitzer, 105mm howitzer, and 75mm tank destroyer versions were produced. One of also well-known versions of the head truck were the double and quadruple technical anti-aircraft mounts. Over 50,000 produced given to all the Allies. Our version is the M2 White. And following it is the unsung hero of the war effort. It's a little known fact, but the combat vehicles and combat troops that engage enemy on the front line consist perhaps of 30% of the entire unit. The rest of the unit are the rear guard, support, including the supply. The forward elements might be good for a day or two without being resupplied. That's why the trucks, the motor pool, was as important as the combat troops. 70% of all the combat units are the rear guard units. And ours here is the most iconic CMC CCKW 353, a 2.5-ton truck. They were commonly called Jimmies. After the war, in Korea and Vietnam, they gained the name of Deuce and a Half, but not during the war. Thank you very much for that participation of our American troops, forward troops. Now that tank destroyers would be deployed in areas where Germany achieved a breakthrough. But it was a very faulty doctrine, because things happened very quickly on the battlefield. Once the enemy attacked, the reaction time would not allow for the tank destroyer units to be deployed in time in many cases. That's why tank destroyers, despite for their mission, were used quite often as tanks, even though they had very thin armor or just as field artillery. Now, the next segment of our demonstration is the American artillery. Again, United States had some of the best artillery. in the world of any army, and in many cases that was the deciding factor in suppressing enemy activity, thwarting their attacks. Very accurate, well-aimed artillery fire still will destroy any existing army up to today. The lead vehicle is the M5 high-speed tractor. Now, truck vehicles are superior in conditions like today. Remember the French 75 being towed by a civilian truck got stuck. So to overcome issues like that, truck vehicles were deployed to tow heavy guns. This is a 155 millimeter M1 howitzer. It's a medium gun. This is not the heavy long-term 155. So this is a medium gun. The long-term guns would ride on 3 axles and would be towed by a heavier M4 high-speed tractor. Following it, it's another version of our good friend, the 2.5-ton CCKW. This is a shorter version designed to tow artillery. And that piece behind our truck is a 105 millimeter howitzer. So, howitzers have certain advantages over a flat trajectory cannon. They can engage other targets, moving targets with their guns depressed nearly horizontally to the ground. But they can also elevate their barrels to a very high angle and engage in plunging fire. In fire actions that go over tree lines, over hills, out of line of sight. And that gave howitzers much greater versatility than the flat trajectory cannons such as the 75 millimeter French cannon that we saw earlier today. These guns, both the 155 and 105, were extremely good and modern designs. So they were used throughout the Korea into the early stages of Vietnam. On many US military bases, the 105s are still used as salute guns. So US artillery fielded other guns, like I said, that were heavier, with larger range and heavier in caliber. Guns that did not need to be broken into several loads for transportation were the 203 millimeter howitzer version of the long tom. One of these guns can be seen in the American Experience Museum here in town, 10 miles from here. And now we have another lesson why 6-wheel drive vehicles are better than 2-wheel drive vehicles. The 2.5-ton truck is a tri-axle drive truck. It does very well in the muddy fields of Gettysburg, but it did equally well in the deep snow and mud of Soviet Russia, in the sands of North Africa, in the hilly rocky terrain of Italy and northwestern Europe. So, American Army fought in Europe, as you know, became one of the largest army of 16 million. And American involvement in a European campaign can be considered one of the most significant and noble deeds that any nation performed on behalf of other oppressed people. Not a single enemy combatant ever landed on US soils. But still, United States sent the cream of their society, their youngest, their brightest, to fight, to liberate others in Europe that were deprived of their freedoms, that were murdered by millions, just to restore their dignity and their freedom. Over 280,000 Americans died in Europe. Over 1 million were wounded and maimed. Those that came without physical harm were probably still not the same. The toll of war, psychological and physical, was enormous on the combatants. And the combatants that fought that war are still remembered as the greatest generation that ever lived. So please, I would like a loud round of applause to our heroes, the Allied armies and the Americans that sacrificed their best to liberate other oppressed people. Doesn't get more American than that.
Now the next vehicle that's coming up here on the track is a duck. The duck is an amphibious truck. This was used to land onto the beaches before harbors or other means for offloading equipment. The duck is based on the CCKW chassis, which you just saw drive around. This is the long wheel based version. You notice that the tires on it are very big. They're 1,100, 1,800 tires. The reason the tires are that size is so they can travel over sand without sinking. The duck is also the first vehicle that was ever designed with a central tire inflation system, so you can adjust the tire pressure for the different terrains that you're on, whether it was sand, coral, hard surfaces, snow. You can take the tire pressure from 15 pounds all the way up to 50 pounds. It's an onboard air compressor. The vehicle you see behind the duck is the M29 Weasel. It was built by Studebaker. Earlier you saw a Studebaker US-6 on the arena, built by the same company. The Weasel was originally developed for a special mission to go after the heavy water plants because of the the Germans with their wartime production. The design was so successful it was used in other theaters of the war. It is also amphibious. It does very well in the snow. If you notice up on the rear, those are the rudders of how you steer the Weasel in the water. The propulsion system on the Weasel is actually its tracks. As the duck comes around here, as it passes by, you will see the propeller on the rear of the vehicle. Now, there are several companies around the U.S., the Wisconsin Dells, the Boston Duck Tours, and the Washington, D.C., the D.C. Ducks, that offer tours on land and sea on these vehicles, but they've been heavily modified for normal and modern use. The drivetrain in this duck is all original and has flown several times at the Pontiac D-Day event. As it turns around, you can see the propeller tucked up underneath the hull there and the rudder.
Now it says as the weasel comes around here, its propulsion system is its tracks. You see how wide the tracks are on the weasel? That's why it does so well in the snow and also in muddy conditions, because it kind of floats across the surface. Now, in typical U.S. Army fashion, if something works, the Army always has to make it better. So the Army decided, well, if the duck is good, we can make a better duck. It became the Super Duck. Well, the Super Duck wasn't as good as the original duck. And they said, well, we're going to make something even better. We're going to make even a bigger duck. And the bigger duck didn't work as original as the original duck. So why mess with something when it works? Ducks actually saw service up until, with several foreign militaries, up into the 80s, and they were surplused out to many municipalities for fire rescue works and also for civil defense. Take it back, Dave. Back. Yes, it's good.
So the ducks were used during every Allied amphibious landing, starting with the North African landings in 1942, Sicilian landings in 1943, Italian landings in 1943, Normandy landings in 1944, and crossing of the Rhine in 1945.
This truck was specifically built to tow the 155 millimeter long tom. Now earlier you saw a 155 millimeter howitzer towed behind the high-speed tractor. The 155 long tom was an artillery piece. This truck here has been across the Atlantic 4 times. It was originally built in January 1945. It was sent over. It came back in 1951 and was rebuilt by the Corbett Corporation down in Henderson, North Carolina. It was sent back over and given to the British Ministry of Defense. It was surplused out in 1968. It made its fourth and final trip back across the Atlantic and ended up at Sam Weiler Motors in Ohio, where it sat outside for the next 25 years. Another collector bought 3 of these trucks, restored one. They were sold to another collector in the early 2000s. The collection acquired this truck in 2018, and a complete frame-off restoration was done. On this truck, on the cab, everything is new on that cab. We got these blueprints from the Mack Museum up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And she is rated at 7.5 tons, which is vastly underrated. So that cab, if you notice how big it is when it comes around, is a 4-person cab. The other 10 members of the gun crew would sit in the back, along with all the ammunition and powder charges on the back. As the truck comes around, you'll see a big loop around the back of the cargo bay. It's a chainsaw. Raising the trails of the gun. So when you look up, in front of them is a 20,000-pound winch, which is for self-recovery. The next vehicle behind it is the War of France Series 5 Wrecker. This is a 1943 version. This is set up for 1900. This wrecker out here has all the tools that up to what's called fourth echelon maintenance. This echelon maintenance means you have to go back to the motor pool. That is a crane on the back. It's rated at 20,000 pounds. This is used to retrieve engines out of tanks or other lifting jobs that it was assigned to. So you said War of France. Everybody knows that as fire truck manufacturers, they also built these wreckers. The other manufacturer was Kenworth. This was the standard wrecker in the U.S. Army up until the early 50s, until the later M-Series came out. The foreign militaries used these up until the 90s. This truck was re-imported back to the United States in the early 2000s out of Holland. I was completely refurbished on the market. This is to move tanks around to the question, and also heavy other lifting jobs. Now the mount that's going around is actually powered by a Max UI 707. The whole driveline on it is this built by Max, the transmission, the axle. On the War of France is what's called an assembled truck. So it uses a Continental engine, it uses a Fuller transmission, it uses a Wisconsin transfer case, and Tipton axles. Now everybody today is worried about fuel economy. Both of these trucks, on a good day, going downhill with a tailwind to get 2 miles to the gallon. Our heavies are making one final lap. Quite impressive. These are some of the biggest real gasoline-powered vehicles ever built. We're going to go back to our narrative of World War II in Europe. We kind of stopped the narrative with the first Allied victory over the skies of Great Britain, preventing Germany from invading Great Britain. At that time, Great Britain stood alone. And the only theater of operation where there was any activity in late 1940 and 1941 was northern Italy. German ally, Italy, invaded parts of France towards the end stages of that campaign, when they were reasonably sure that Germany were going to win against France in 1940. And then, emboldened by the German success in France, they attacked a British colony of Egypt from their Libyan territory. They met with devastating defeat in late 1940. They lost 140,000 personnel with very light British losses. So they ate some humble pie. They asked their superior ally Germany to send some reinforcements in the form of the Africa Corps, led by a little-known general called Erwin Rommel, who became a very famous desert fox, Erwin Rommel. German support was very important to drive British out of Libya into the gates of Egypt. The vehicles in North Africa looked very much like that. They were painted sand color to blend with the landscape there.
But you see these weird patches, bluish, grayish patches. Why? Think of the desert as a sea of sand. Square vehicles stand out like sore thumbs to the aerial observer. Making these lines breaks that geometry, square geometry of these vehicles, disguising them as perhaps rock formations. What's being towed behind that gun is one of the best early guns, still very small in size, the 2-pounder. As the Germans started developing larger and heavier tanks based on their engagements with British in North Africa and Russians and with Russians on the Eastern Front, their tanks became bigger and heavier armed. So that small gun started losing its effectiveness at the time of 1941. Now, once Africa Corps landed in early 1941, they pushed British into Egypt. Nevertheless, they were not able to capture a very critical port of Tobruk on Libyan coast. Now, warfare requires a lot of material. The German supply lines became very long. For every gallon of fuel delivered, several gallons had to be burned. For Germany to have any chance to defeat British in Egypt and invade their oil fields in Iran, in Iraq, they had to get more supplies. But Australian division defended Tobruk from April through November, depriving of 1941, depriving Germans of that resupply port. Eventually, Germans were pushed back to where they started in Libya. The port of Tobruk was liberated, was opened up, and there is a Polish angle to that. Some of the Polish personnel that filtered from Poland in 1939 reformed in French Syria. Once France was defeated, they migrated to the British Palestine, occupied Palestine, and were shipped to Tobruk. The Polish brigade, Carpathian Brigade, spent over 100 days in the besieged city of Tobruk, the longest of any unit, and they participated in the eventual breakout of Tobruk. The campaign in Africa saw seesaw action. British repelled Germans once more. Germany returned in 1942, reached a city of El Alamein in late 1942, and there the German retreat began. El Alamein, victorious battle for El Alamein in October and November of 1942, started retreat for German and Italian armies that did not end until their eventual defeat in May of 1943 in Tunisia. That was aided by the first action of American army in the greater European theater of operations. Those were amphibious landings in the French Vichy colonies of Morocco and Algeria. So now the German Africa Corps and their Italian allies were caught in a pincer between Americans to the west, British to the east. Once African campaign ended in May of 1943, was followed by Sicilian landings in June of 1943 and subsequent landings in September of 1943 in mainland, finally mainland of Europe. Allies are back to Europe in September of 1943. That throws Italy out of the war. They become occupied by Germany, and now the soft underbelly of Europe is being invaded by allies, combined American, British, New Zealand, Australian armies. Their initial progression was stopped 80 miles short of Rome at the heavily defended mountainous Gustav Line with the linchpin position of Monte Cassino, an abbey, a monastery. 3 very bloody attacks occurred in the winter of 1943-44, all were defeated. The 4th final attack achieved a breakthrough in May of 1944. That breakthrough was achieved by a Polish 2nd Corps, and we see the vehicles that were used by the Polish 2nd Corps. The lead vehicle is a tank on wheels, that Stackhouse, American-made Stackhouse heavy armored car. Following it is a Canadian-built armored car. The 3rd vehicle in line is the Otter, Canadian, GM Canada Otter armored car, and the last vehicle is the American M3 Scout car. Look how similar it is to the F-trucks that we saw earlier. So this is the early iteration of a F-truck. So the Polish forces achieved the final breakthrough of the Gustav Line on May 19th of 1944, opening the way to Rome. Rome was liberated on June 4th. Americans learned about that great success on June 5th. But how come we don't remember about that? Because a day later, on June 6th, Americans and British and Canadians landed on D-Day beaches in Normandy. That's why this is one of the lesser known aspects of World War II, Allied successes in Italy. Polish 2nd Corps was formed by Polish personnel that formed an army in the Soviet Russia. Those Polish prisoners of war that were sent to Russian gulags and war camps were allowed, once Germany attacked Russia, to form their own army. Then they were allowed to leave the Soviet Russia, join the Polish forces that fought in Tobruk, and form one of the largest Polish units on Western Front. Polish 2nd Corps fought on throughout the Italian campaign until 1945. Their second engagement was capturing, again, a critical vital port of Ancona on Adriatic, on the eastern coast of Italy. Again, Allied advancing to the boot of Italy required supplies. They had to be brought to the close to the front line. Polish 2nd Corps was instrumental in capturing that critical port of Ancona, independently of other Allied forces. Polish troops fought on, ending up their campaign in 1945, liberating a northern city of Bologna in Italy. Now, the Stackhouse is an American-made vehicle that was rejected by American Army because of its size and its cost. The vehicle that was adopted by the US Army was a much lighter and cheaper M8 Greyhound. Nevertheless, British do like their armored cars. They proved very successful in the deserts of North Africa. In Italy, they were equally successful on the rocky, hilly, pin-turn roads, turn roads of the Italian mountains. And they soldiered on till the end of the war there. Now you see this unusual camouflage. Remember those straight lines of blue and gray on the African terrain vehicles? These vehicles have these patches, sand patches over the underlying green, or vice versa, black patches of the underlying sand color. That was deliberate to blend these vehicles with southern Italian terrain. Now, southern and central Italy is nothing like what you might imagine of the northern Italy, full of trees and green. Southern Italy is more prairie. Think Texas, think Arizona, think New Mexico. Thus, Vehicles that were painted green at the factory stood out. Painting these patches blended them well. We have a contingent, artillery contingent, Allied British artillery contingent, a diesel-powered vehicle called AEC Matador, towing the principal British artillery piece, very much equivalent to our 155 M1 American howitzer, which you saw a few minutes ago. This is a gun howitzer able for direct firing, flat trajectory fire, and plunging fire. Unlike American monster trucks, this is diesel-powered. This vehicle, AEC Matador, became the base for other large vehicles such as the AEC Dorchester, an armored command vehicle that was favored by the British General Bernard Montgomery of the El Alamein victory, but also his arch enemy, Erwin Rommel, who captured several of those on British in North Africa. Also, the same chassis became the basis for the absolutely largest armored car of the war, called AEC Armored Car. In its final version, AEC Armored Car had the same turret as a Cromwell out there with a 75mm multi-purpose gun. So again, we are seeing here a British 5.5-inch gun howitzer, which was used by British on all campaigns, Far East Burma campaign, Italian campaign, North African campaign, and eventually after the landings on Normandy in Western Europe. The crew of the Matador sits in the compartment in the rear. Now what's following the Matador is an American-made FWD R1. It's a relatively average-looking vehicle made in the United States, sent to Europe to equip the Allies. Now this vehicle was used by the Polish artillery supply, but pay attention to that emblem, a little bear on the side of the vehicle. Now, the Polish troops that fought at Monte Cassino formed initially in Middle East. Some of them trained in Syria. Over there, the Polish troops found this little Syrian brown bear cub at the local bazaar. They bought it from that bazaar. They raised it as like a child, fed it while it sat on their lap, ate human food, learned to eat cigarettes. It wanted to mimic its handlers. Nevertheless, the bear was very intelligent, would not eat unlit cigarette. It would just throw them away. The cigarette had to be lit. Now, bear was occasionally helpful, carrying an occasional crate of ammunition, but as you know, those bears, you couldn't count on that reliably. Nevertheless, the bear cheered the men, became a mascot, achieved a rank of corporal, was fed with the ration issued like to every other soldier. Nevertheless, its caloric requirement was way beyond a single infantryman. That's why Wojtek was known to raid the kitchens quite often. Any visitor that wanted to meet Wojtek was obligated to bring some an offering of nutritious food to Wojtek. Wojtek grew up to be a sizable bear, but its worst enemy was a tiny little monkey, a mischievous monkey. Monkey was really nasty to Wojtek and totally terrorized our hero. Wojtek lived to a nice ripe age of 20, retired in a zoo in Scotland. There are many, died in, I believe, in 1963. There are many statues dedicated to Wojtek. That's W-O-J-E-T-K, Wojtek, Polish war bear. Now, the Polish experience in World War II is very bittersweet. Nazi Germany was defeated on December 8, 1945. But Poland was deprived of its independence because Poland became a nominal satellite state of Soviet Russia. Poles still experience brutality, unlike actually like that of the German occupiers, and Poland did not achieve full independence until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. The brave soldiers of the Polish Second Corps could not really return safely to Poland because they would be prosecuted as enemy of the states by the new communist regime there. Many of them settled throughout United States, Canada, Western Europe, South Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand. Many of the Polish commanding officers had their death sentence imposed to them upon their return to Poland. Lower rank and file that did return to Poland faced imprisonment, prosecution, and were deprived of their normal civic rights and opportunities for employment. And again, not until 1989 did Poland regain its full independence. Now, we will be talking about our main event.